Y'all's attention. Whoa, those speakers work. Shh. I need to get y'all's attention because when we're doing this, it's for everyone to hear. We need to kind of pay attention. So first off, I want to say welcome to Rootstock. Appreciate y'all being here for our Four Roses dinner. How many people have been here for a dinner before? Show of hands. Okay, a few of you. How many people are members of either the Woodstock Whiskey Club or the Bourbon Barons? Show of hands. Okay. By the end of the night, the rest of you will be, I promise. So for those of you that are new, my name is Sean Daly. My wife Anna and I own Rootstock. And our little joke is that Anna loves throwing parties. I hate cleaning up after parties. So we built Rootstock. So now we can throw parties for all of our favorite people and not have to clean up after ourselves. So welcome to our party. So tonight we have something a little different, a little bit special. We have some friends from Four Roses joining us virtually. Master Distiller Brent Elliott is with us. Brent, can you say hi? He's muted. There he goes. He's waving. It's all right. We have.
Oh, hello, everyone. I was muted. A common mistake.
Talk. There he is. We have Allison Nunez, also from Four Roses. Allison, going to say hi?
Hello.
And of course, most of us know our good friend Randall Roberts from Real Brands. He actually ran our Four Roses dinner last year. So,
good to see you again.
Randall couldn't make it live with us because he threw out his back, which I can relate to. He's a little bit injured, but he's.
I'm starting to self-medicate again.
There he is. Back pain will be gone in minutes, right? So what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to hand this off to this group here, mainly Brent, and he's going to tell you a little bit about Four Roses. He's going to tell you what the future holds. Maybe give us some hints as to what's coming on down the road. And then you guys will have an opportunity to ask questions of a master distiller that you may not have been able to ask before. So without further ado, I am going to hand it off to Brent. Brent, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first, I'd like to say thank you all for joining us here, or maybe I'm joining you, I guess it feels like. But I wish I could be there in person. This is the next best thing, though. So I appreciate that you all are sitting there to hear a little bit about Four Roses. And hopefully you get to enjoy some Four Roses tonight. So I have some time here to talk a little bit about, I guess, just Four Roses in general. I think I'll talk about the history, but I know a lot of you may have questions. So I'll leave plenty of time after talk just general Four Roses for you guys to, take the conversation anywhere you'd like. You can ask questions of me or Allison or Randall, and hopefully we can answer them. Whether it's Four Roses in general, bourbon production or uniqueness, whatever you'd like to ask about. But I think what's important, especially now for us at Four Roses, is how rapidly we've been growing and what we've been doing to make sure that we can keep providing bourbon for everyone in all the markets in the U.S. And I think to understand that, I should probably go back in history. So I'll give you a quick history lesson if you don't mind. So the Four Roses brand is actually a very old brand that began, whether you know it or not, in Atlanta. And when it started, it was Paul Jones Jr., our founder. He unfortunately had to leave Atlanta, though, because even though this was years before Prohibition, there were certain counties and towns that had local prohibition laws that were starting to come into effect. And so the writing was on the wall that, his days were possibly numbered in Atlanta, at least for selling whiskey. So he packed up his brand, his family, and his company, and he moved up to Louisville, Kentucky, where he continued selling Four Roses bourbon. He trademarked the brand in 1888, and the name is actually to commemorate a certain occasion. And that occasion was he proposed marriage to this lovely Southern belle, and she said, if my answer is yes, I will signify that by wearing a corsage of 4 red roses to the upcoming grand ball. And fortunately for us, she wore the corsage of 4 red roses, indicating that she would marry Mr. Jones. And so that's where the name came from, the Four Roses. And he continued selling Four Roses up to and actually through Prohibition. his company was one of 6 that was allowed to continue selling for medicinal purposes only during Prohibition. So you could actually go to your physician and get a prescription. I think it was every 10 days, you get 1 pint of 100 proof whiskey. And it was treated just like medicine today, like a prescription. It had we have a few in the gift shop that you can, when you come visit, you can actually see them, where the doctor would have the dosage, the names, the pharmacy, all that information was on there, just like on a prescription today. Couldn't tell you exactly what it was used to treat, but I think depending on your relationship with the physician, but you could get the whiskey for whatever ailed you. Now that's what's important. So for us, it was important because prior to Prohibition, there were hundreds of labels, hundreds of distilleries all over the country, and once all these brands were shut down, once the distilleries were mothballed, a lot of these brands were just lost to history. But because we were always available as a medicine, we were always in the public's consciousness. So after Prohibition, we quickly became one of the top selling bourbons in the U.S. And we continued pretty much one of the most premium, one of the most sought after, one of the highest volume sales bourbons up until the late 50s. And what happened was, after Prohibition in 1943, Seagram's, the Canadian company, they came in and they purchased the brand. And they helped continue to elevate the status and the sales of Four Roses. But then in the late 50s, they did something that was kind of interesting. They took the Four Roses name and they traded what was in the bottle. It was a straight bourbon whiskey. They put a Canadian style blended whiskey in the bottle. And they took the bourbon and they made it export only. So from the late 50s all the way up until 2002, you could still get Four Roses bourbon, but you had to go to France or Spain or Tokyo. You could not get it in the US. What was in the bottle was this, in my opinion, it's a Canadian style blended whiskey. So it wasn't a straight bourbon whiskey. So let's say it was a different liquid. And I think that really damaged our reputation. I know it damaged our reputation in that time period. And the reason, looking back, the reason they did that was the consumers' tastes were changing. This was when people were leaning more towards the vodkas and the gins and the lighter spirits. And if you've ever had a blended whiskey, clearly it is lighter than a straight bourbon whiskey. It doesn't have the body, it doesn't have the structure. And so they were trying to maintain the equity or keep the equity that the Four Roses name had, but they wanted to meet the tastes of the consumer. The other reason they did it was sort of a business reason, was if you're making a blended whiskey, you don't need that much straight bourbon whiskey to create a bottle of it. You can just take a portion of straight bourbon whiskey, and the remainder can be grain neutral spirits, coloring, other liquids to supplement that final volume. So that was kind of the situation in 2002 when Kirin, the Japanese beer company, came in and they purchased the brand from Seagram's. And when they did that, it was to retain the rights to distribute Four Roses in Japan, because they'd been distributing it for years. It was a top seller and still is a top seller in Japan. But they just didn't want another company to come in and buy Four Roses and change that in any way. And fortunately for us, Jim Rutledge, my predecessor, the master distiller at the time, he'd been trying to get Four Roses back into the U.S. for many years, but Seagram's really wasn't receptive to his idea. So he saw this as his opportunity to ask Kirin if they would bring Four Roses back as a bourbon to the U.S. And fortunately for us, they said yes. And looking back, it was an excellent business decision. But when they agreed to that, it was really just an act of goodwill to the company that they just purchased. They had no idea that we were just a few years away from maybe the biggest bourbon boom ever, this bourbon renaissance that we've experienced in the last 10 to 15 years. So we started out modestly. We started out just in Kentucky. And then over time, we started adding more and more states. And we started to notice that year over year, we were growing significantly, like 60, 70% year over year. But on one hand, we realized that what we were dealing with, it was small volumes. And so while we were excited about the relative growth, we realized that the absolute numbers weren't that big just yet. But this kept happening year over year. And so fast forward to about 2012, 2013, we started to realize that what we were selling was a significant volume, at least for us, and that the growth was not slowing down. So at that point, we realized we had to do a few things. One is we had to slow that growth a little bit. So at that time, we were still in all 50 states, but we weren't in every store in every state. We weren't as accessible as some other well-known bourbon brands. So we kind of pulled back our efforts in that aggressive expansion. So that was the first thing we did. The second thing, which is more positive, is we realized that we had to expand. And the expansion that we needed was pretty much everywhere. We had a bottleneck in bottling, pardon the pun. We had a bottleneck in distillation. We had a bottleneck in warehouse space. So across the board, we evaluated our entire operation and realized the best way to meet this growing demand in the U.S. was to double the size of our distillery. Now, that's always a challenge, especially when you're making bourbon whiskey, because there are so many things that we can control in the production process. But part of what makes straight bourbon whiskey so unique, in my opinion, is the fact that there's so many external variables that contribute to the final flavor, whether it's the wood, the grains, the weather, just so many small contributing factors that we can control some of these, some we can't. Some are just left to Mother Nature. And with straight bourbon whiskey, one of the stipulations is you can't adulterate the flavor or the color in any way. So because of these guidelines, because we can't adulterate it, we want a consistent product. And because of all these small variables that can change the flavor profile, we wanted to change as few parts of the production process as possible when we embarked on this expansion project. So what we decided to do was to do it on site in the existing building, which is an historic building that was built in 1910, and approach it that way. So it made the project that much more difficult. If we just chosen a green field and put a distillery up from scratch, even on the back of our property, that would have been much easier, much cheaper. But we realized that we could possibly be tempting fate by changing some of these variables that maybe we don't understand. So that's exactly what we did. We took all the existing equipment, we had to move some around, and we brought new equipment into the existing space to essentially double our capacity. So the easy way to look at it is everything that we had one of 5 years ago, we now have two of. And we now have the ability to produce twice as much whiskey. That's great, but you also need a place to store this whiskey, and you need a way to bottle this much extra whiskey. So we're actually building new warehouses. We've had to expand our bottling facility to meet the growing demand. So we're happy to now be through all the expansion phase, at least for the distillery and the bottling house. Last year, we finally put the finishing touches on the distillery expansion. We're currently not producing twice as much bourbon as we were, say, 2 years ago, because with straight bourbon whiskey, as you know, you don't make it one day and sell it the next. For us, our youngest product is Four Roses Bourbon, and that has a combination of 5, 6, and sometimes older bourbons in it. So our youngest product has to sit in the barrel for at least 5 years. And we know that 5 years from now, we're not going to double our sales overnight. It's going to be a more gradual growth. So we're kind of mimicking that with our production planning. We're stepping up our production every year to, let's say within the next 2 or 3 years, we will be at full capacity just to meet that demand in the future. So speaking of Four Roses Bourbon, another thing I want to touch on here is the uniqueness of our products and what makes each one taste different than the next. And I think you guys might have a single barrel there taste, so I'll talk about that too. But starting with the Four Roses Bourbon, this is 80 proof. As I mentioned, it's at least 5 years old. And this has been around for a long time. And I mentioned that we can't control the flavor entirely. We have a lot of ways to control the processes, but what comes out of the barrel ultimately is somewhat of a surprise. Every barrel is not exactly the same. And so Seagram's way back when, they realized that while that's interesting that every bourbon is different, every batch could be slightly different, they realized that the consumers expected consistency. So to offer a consistent product, they started producing different recipes. And by different recipes, I mean different bourbons. It all starts with 2 different mash bills or grain recipes and 5 different yeast strains. And if you take 2 mash bills and multiply that by 5, the 5 yeast strains, that gives you 10 different recipes. So at our distillery, at any given day, if you come to visit, we're producing one of those 10 recipes. And each one of those recipes gets mashed or milled, mashed, fermented, distilled, and aged independently of the other ones. And then we pull them when they're ready to be used for whichever product they're going into. But this product uses up to all 10 recipes, and those are used for consistency. Now, we still use the recipes for consistency, but in 2004, in 2006, when we decided to expand our portfolio a little bit because we were selling, a few thousand cases, we introduced small batch. And really, that was the first time here in the U.S. market that we went back to the 10 recipes and decided to showcase those in a different way. So we worked on test blends and came up with a unique formula which utilizes just 4 of those recipes. And by doing that, we created something that was totally different from the single barrel, which was on the shelves, and the Four Roses bourbon. And the recipes that were chosen for that, it's both mash bills split evenly down the middle, the high rye and the low rye. And it also utilizes our K yeast and our O yeast. The K yeast creates nice baking spice flavors and aromas. The O yeast is very rich and fruity. So it's a nice balance between the fruit and the spice. The single barrel, which I missed chronologically, we actually released this in 2004 in the U.S. market. And this is one recipe. The 100 proof version of single barrel is always the same. It's the high rye mash bill, which I didn't mention is 35% rye, which is about as high as you're going to find in any bourbon from a major producer in the U.S. 16% more rye, and that would be a rye whiskey. But it uses that mash bill, and it also uses our V yeast, which creates delicate and fruity flavors. So this is also a blend between the fruit and spice, kind of like the small batch, but the spice in this one comes from the rye more than it does in the small batch, and the fruit is a different kind of fruit. The V fruit is more apricot, green apple, more of the delicate fruits, whereas the small batch fruit is like maraschino cherries and red ripe fruits, stone fruits. So those were our 3 products from 2006 until 2019. And then last year, we released Small Batch Select. And Atlanta was one of the fortunate 5 markets in the whole country that we rolled out with this initially. This year, we've added 13 more markets. But last year, you guys received this probably in April. And this is one that we're super proud of because we don't put out a new product, a standard product every year, every 6 months, or very often, just to see what sticks. With this, we waited and we thought about what the consumers were looking for. And with that, a few things came to mind. We realized that the modern consumer is looking for variety in their bourbons. A few of the things that a lot of the feedback we get is that people really like to experience bourbons non-chill filtered, and they like barrels or bottles at higher strength. So that's exactly what we did with this. We decided to bottle it at 104 proof and to do no chill filtration with it. And of course, it is small batch, so we expanded on the whole small batch platform that began in 2006. And by that, I mean, we went back to the 10 recipes and we formulated a unique recipe combination to create this flavor profile. And with this one, it is 6 different recipes. It's both mash bills, not split evenly down the middle, but it is both mash bills. And it utilizes the K yeast, which is the spicy yeast that's also in the small batch. But then it uses the V and the F. The V is the one from the single barrel. The F is one that you only find in Four Roses bourbon at small percentages. It's in this at a high percentage, and it's a very unique yeast strain. It's our herbal yeast strain. It creates minty, clove-like, some spearmint flavors. And with this in particular, I think the way that F and the V work together, they create a very unique, fruity, kind of minty flavor that you won't find in any of our other products. And then with the K, I think that balances out and gives you that nice spice. It's gives it some structure and some extra body. So that's just a quick run through intro of our products. I will say, I know that because you have a single barrel down there, I'll talk a little bit about what makes this unique. For the single barrel, we do test blends. We're always sampling barrels for these other products to make sure that they're consistent and that we hit the same flavor profile every time we bottle these. With single barrel, we have to go one step further, because with this, every one of these represents one barrel. So you dump a barrel and it goes into between 150 to 200 bottles. So because of that, there's no way that we're going to let a barrel get through that isn't exactly to our specifications. So in this process, first we select or we earmark barrels once they hit 4 years of age for the individual products. So single barrel that you have, at 4 years of age, we identified that batch of that recipe and set it aside. Didn't use it for anything else. We let it age for 3 more years. And then we sampled all those batches from that year that had been set aside. And then we super selected the ones that had matured the way we had hoped. And then we went on to the real intense step, and that is sampling every single barrel out of that batch. And each batch that is earmarked for single barrel, or any batch that we make at all, is somewhere between 280 and 290 barrels typically. So we sample every single one of those barrels and bring it to the lab and smell and sometimes taste each one of those barrels to approve it before that goes on to bottling to be put into single barrel. And the profiles we're looking for on this, kind of like I described with the balance between the fruit and the spice, but in particular, we like the structure, the mouthfeel, a nice finish, make sure the fruit's coming through cleanly, and is, again, that rye, I mentioned that it's one of the highest ryes in the industry, and it wouldn't take that much more to be a rye whiskey. But with this one in particular, the way it works with that yeast strain, I think the rye comes through so cleanly and dominantly on this one that that is kind of one of the criteria that we look for in these, is to make sure that that rye is as robust and clean as people have come to expect with single barrels. But I mentioned consistency is impossible to attain when you're looking at a single batch or a single barrel. And that's true for these two. Every barrel that you get is going to be a little different from even the barrel sitting right next to it in the warehouse, or the single barrel you bought the year before. And that's impossible for us to control. But at the same time, I think that's really what makes single barrels unique. Each one is a unique, has a unique flavor profile. You're not going to find it in any other barrel. So, and because of that, we've also expanded our barrel program just from the single recipe. We also do private barrels at barrel strength, and those can be any of the 10 recipes, and they're typically aged 8 to 12 years. It's a great program, but if you're looking to try some of our different recipes, so if you want to maybe experience our high rye mash bill with our spicy yeast, or the low rye mash bill with the floral yeast, and these barrels are out there. So it's something that's really unique to us, and something that consumers, and especially people that are really excited or interested or have curious about bourbon, really seem to enjoy, because you can taste all the differences in all these products. And I don't think I mentioned the proof of the small batch. It's 90. It's at least 6 years. Small batch select, it's 104. Like I mentioned, it's 6 and 7 years, and the single barrel is at least 7. So there are differences in proofs and ages across these different products, but when you taste them side by side, most of that difference that you taste is attributed to the different recipes that we use in each one of these. So that felt like a mouthful right there. So that's kind of, the brief history of Four Roses, where we've been, how we've gotten to where we are, and what we've done to continue to offer Four Roses bourbon to the U.S. market. And I should mention that all this expansion, all this growth, it's all here in the U.S. Because we've been in Europe and Japan for so many years, those are mature markets for us. We do well there, and we sell a good volume, but it's pretty stable. It's pretty steady. It's all this growth in the U.S., which has just exploded for us and the industry as a whole over the last 10 years. All of this is just to meet the demand here in the U.S. So I think now's a good time to open up the floor to questions if anyone has any, or if anyone would like me to talk about anything else in particular.
I'm sure we've got a few questions. What you got?
What is the oldest barrel of whiskey you have still in the barrel at Four Roses?
Did you hear that?
Yeah, the oldest, I can tell exactly to the year, but we have a few barrels here and there of maybe some 25, 26-year-old barrels. And really, the way, the thing about aging barrels, in most cases, somewhere between 5 and 10 years old is typically the sweet spot. Now, there are a lot of exceptions. There are a lot of great 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and even 20-year-old whiskeys out there. And if you look at our limited editions or even our private selections that are a little bit older, those are the batches that we identify as aging in a very mellow fashion. They're not getting too oaky, too astringent. They still have some of that original vibrant character of the yeast strains or the rye or the corn. They seem to still be aging well. So we set those aside, and for the really old ones, those are kind of in the pool for the limited editions. But at a certain age, and we evaluate these every year, these batches that are set aside just for the limited editions. Every year there are some of those batches that, and you can see it coming, they start to peak. And if they're not chosen, not selected to be used in the limited edition, those barrels will start to go downhill, start to become out of balance, too oaky. And in most cases, we'll pull those and dump them into Four Roses bourbon. I don't want to mislead you and make you think that any significant portion of this is 20-year-old whiskey, but there is, a few times a year, older barrels go into this, but it's just a handful of barrels and a dump of 300-400 barrels. So it's not a marketing point or anything, but that's just to illustrate that at a certain age, the barrels do become up to the point where they're really not. I don't want to speak for everyone because I know plenty of people would love to taste them, and I wish I had some samples there for you all to taste to prove my point. But in most cases, once they hit that age, they're too oaky. They're kind of flat. All of that fruit or spice has kind of been overshadowed by that flat oakiness. But we do keep some around, just like those oldest ones. I just enjoy sampling them every year and keeping a couple in the lab to illustrate my point sometimes when I'm talking about those old barrels. And some of those aren't terrible. Again, because the reason they made it that long without being dumped is because they were still interesting. But yeah, we do have a handful of those. The oldest we've actually used in Al's 50th, Al Young, he was our brand ambassador who passed away this past December. We did a commemorative or a 50th anniversary bottle to commemorate his 50 years with Four Roses in 2017. And he was adamant that he wanted something very old in that whiskey. So we actually pulled out a 23-year-old, and it was in there at a small percentage. I think it was between 6 and 8% of the final blend. But that was the oldest whiskey we've used in any of these products. And it turned out great. It was a great batch. And even this year's limited edition small batch, which should be down there probably the next month or so, that utilizes a 19-year-old at 19%. So I think that's, if you look at the age and the percentage, that's a big chunk of old whiskey for our limited editions. But it's always difficult to try to blend those so that you can take the good characteristics out of that old batch and kind of blend out the not so good characteristics. Because that 19-year-old had a lot of great fruit, a lot of depth, richness, a great mouthfeel, but it did have the flip side. It did have some of that astringency, some of that that old oaky flavor. So I think with this one, and same thing with Al's or any when we try to use an older whiskey, the challenge is to sort of mute that or bring it down to a level where it's more subtle. So it reminds you that it's an old whiskey, but it doesn't make you don't pucker up because of the astringency or the wood. You want to get that level just right, and you want to use those other characteristics with other batches to create the more delicate or rich and fruity, spicy tones. So I know that was just a simple question with a long answer, but I hope that answered it.
I mean, I read about Booker's when they released their 30th. They used some really old whiskey, and they said it was terrible on some of these, too much, but they had to cut it down to make the nose palatable. And it just was like it was stringent, too much wood.
Okay, Sean, can you repeat that? I couldn't hear that question.
He was saying that when he was talking to Booker's, when they did their 30th, they did a similar thing where they did some older whiskeys and they had to blend it down because there was way too much wood in the older ones, just like what you were saying.
Okay.
Good.
Do we expect another Elliott Select down the road?
Maybe when I hit like some big milestone. Yeah, the Elliott Select, if any of you know the Four Roses history, Jim Rutledge was our master distiller, or he was with Seagram's and Four Roses for 49 years. And, he's was and still is an icon in the industry. So when Jim retired in 2005 and I took over, the marketing department essentially came to me and they said, we need to do something to let the world know that, we're still here and we've got a master distiller that we have faith in and we want to introduce you in some way. So they wanted to do the Elliott Select. I was really quick to let everyone know, this isn't commemorating anything. This is, I've only been in this role for a few months. This is really just an opportunity to kind of introduce me as the new guy. And unfortunately, they did it by putting my head on the side of the bottle. But, I don't expect to have an Elliott Select anytime soon. But it was a good one. And an interesting fact about that is if you follow Four Roses history, we started the single barrel limited editions to commemorate Jim's 40th anniversary in 2007. And then we did one in 2008, 2009. We did a single barrel every year up until 2014. We did one in 2014. But then we announced that we were going to discontinue that because the volumes were getting so large on those and the demand was getting so high that we couldn't consistently find batches that big in that age range that were that good year after year. So we decided to use some of that liquid, retain it so that we could use it in small batch limited editions. So we announced that, no more limited edition single barrels. We're done with those. And then we didn't do it in 2015. And then we decided to do Elliott Select. So we kind of went back on all that and did one more limited edition single barrel, and that was the Elliott Select. And we may do another one, depending on our inventory in the future, but we won't be doing one every year. But I learned after we said never, just never say never again. We might do one again sometime.
I have a question.
Yes.
Different recipes, which one has been consistently your personal favorite?
I like how you phrase that. I get asked that a lot, and I can't say which is my favorite, but there have been some that, for a period of time I gravitate to, whether it's, in the samples I'm looking at in the lab or the private barrel program. But I would say recently in the private barrel program, I've really been enjoying the OESVs, which is a little surprising to me. I like the low rye mash bill. I like the V yeast, but it's not overly spicy. It's not overly fruity. It's just kind of right there in the middle, just very understated and subtle and mellow. So recently that's kind of been my go-to. If you start looking at older barrels, like 12 to 16 years old, I like the OESKs a lot. I think they age out very well. As you can see, the Elliott Select was a 14-year-old OESK. But there are times where I'll do a barrel selection and I'll pick a Q or an O or an F. So at one time or another, any of the recipes has been my favorite or have been my favorites. But consistently, it's hard to say definitively that I like one over the others. And it's dependent on age too. Like I said, it's easy to say at 14 years old, if I have all 10 out in front of me, probably in most cases, the OESK or the OESV is going to be my favorite. I could say at 7, 8 years, probably more consistently. The other ones would be OBSV. So I just think at that age, it's like a perfect crossroads between the rye, the fruit, and the oak, and the vanilla and the caramel. I think that's a perfect crossroads there. The Qs, I think at 9 years, that's the sweet spot for them, or 8 to 11, 9 on average. So yeah, I never give a straight answer on that. It's because I really don't have one that I can say is always my favorite, but it's the best I can do.
Other questions?
On the production of the 10 mash bills for the single barrel you were just talking about, are they produced kind of evenly, or is it more on demand? And the reason I ask, I've been trying to get all 10 for like 4 years. I have 9. I have never seen an OBSO. So are they produced evenly, or is it based on demand?
That's a great question. Okay, when we produce in any given year, what we do is we look out, 5 to 10 years at what the sales projections are, our best guess. And that's really all it is when you're dealing with bourbon whiskey. So we backtrack and look at how much we need to produce for each one of those products in the upcoming years. And then as those barrels age, for example, for small batch, it's a perfect example here. That's all 6 and 7 year old barrels. So the barrels that meet that profile, that are very spicy and very fruity, those will be set aside, reserved for small batch. And they all get consumed at 6 and 7 years old. So none of those barrels make it out past that 7 year mark. I shouldn't say none, but most of those get consumed in that time period. But when we're selecting these batches for private selections or limited editions, we're pulling from that general pool, because when we're producing, we don't know that this batch is going to be a single barrel or a private selection or a small batch. We don't know that until we start looking at the barrels at 4 years of age. So we start pulling them out a tier or 2 tiers or 3 tiers at a time and setting them aside to age longer. The problem with some of these batches is that they happen to be like the OBSO or OBSK. They happen to be recipes that are also used in small batch. And because our small batch sales have been greater than we had anticipated, we've had to keep more of that allocated small batch whiskey allocated to small batch. We weren't able to pull as much aside to age longer to be used for the private selections. So that's why I'm having a hard time finding the OBSO. We try to allocate as much as we can, but with a small batch, it's a set percentage. So if we took, say, 5% away from small batch, 5% of the OBSO from small batch to use for this, that could be a 5%. We couldn't just fill in the gap with the other recipes. That's part of the flavor profile. So that would reduce 5% of what we could sell of OBSK, 5% of the OESO, and 5% of the OESK. So it's all a balancing game, and I kind of oversimplified it, but that's pretty much the balancing that has to go on to maintain the consistency of all the products.
It sounds like the Whiskey Club needs to come up to Four Roses and pick an OBSO.
They're out there, just not a whole lot of them.
We're patient.
So it seems that from so many distilleries, you're one that puts out everything that you guys do. Pretty clear with every mash bill for every recipe. You guys don't hold back, disclose everything 100%. And we are very happy about that because we know what we drink. People are very educated. Your website explains everything on what's in every bottle. You just, even when you get the bottle, the tiers, the warehouse. So you guys don't hold back any information for your customers, for your clients. That's a big thing into the bourbon world. You see now all these companies that come up that source barrel, source juice, and you're gonna struggle to find information. Even if you go back to the older juice, you gotta fight to find the information. You guys are full transparent every time you put something out, and that's great. I love that.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I think a lot of that is just we want to be transparent. We're proud of what we do, But I think we, because we're unique and because we want to communicate all those details, and we can't just say, okay, yeah, we make OBSO and OESK, that would just confuse people. So we almost have to be super upfront and explain in super detail everything that we do. And now consumers want to hear that. So we're happy to talk, pull the curtain back and show them exactly how we produce it, what we do that's unique. There are no secrets. And really, the comments like that really, make me realize and make us realize that, it's appreciated. And so it's sort of a win-win situation. It's great for consumers and it's great for us that you guys appreciate that we're that transparent.
Yeah, when we ever have someone new to bourbon that joins the club, we direct them to the Four Roses site just to start their basic education on recipes and how that works. And it's because you guys provide so much information. It's almost like an education site, really. So we really appreciate that. It's fantastic information.
Thank you. Or you're welcome. I don't know.
Both works. You got it here? Okay. So a small group of us from the club came up last year did the Bourbon Trail, and we met an interesting, wonderful, wonderful lady by the name of Mary White, who runs your tasting room up there and by the Rick houses in the where did we go? We went to the so one of our guys just wanted to ask how Mary was doing. He's probably like, "Here's Mary."
Are you thinking Mandy?
No, it's definitely Mary. Mary White. She even has a Rick house with her initials, and she makes a bottle from the gift shop that has her initials on it. And
I'll ask and find out. She must be at the warehouse facility. Is that where you were?
Is, yeah, that's where she.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe she might have been new. I try to get over there occasionally, and I know most of the gift shop people over there, but I know that since COVID, I've been over there a few times, but we're kind of working on a skeleton crew over there. So hopefully she's still there, but I haven't been to that gift shop since this all started.
She is, because she is fantastic. She needs a raise.
Well, I will make a point. I will reach out to her.
Definitely do. Everyone enjoys visiting with Mary. She definitely represents you all very, very well.
Well, she will appreciate that. Thank you.
Let me get this one real quick. Go ahead.
Hey, recently there seems to be a big surge in refinished or double barrel. Has Four Roses ever considered experimenting with it, or have they?
We've nothing officially. I'm sitting around, just shooting the breeze, or around the having coffee with some of the guys around there. It's come up, about how that would be pretty cool, or maybe that'd be a good idea, but we haven't taken it to the next level of like actually doing that. There's really a reason for that. Same reason we haven't done a rye whiskey, which someone might be about to ask that. I get that question a lot. But really the reason we haven't done anything outside of our core Four Roses production is just because we haven't had the capacity or the resources to do anything other than what we do with 10 recipes and just trying to keep up with the demand. But now we're kind of getting into that period, or we are into that period now, that we do have extra capacity. We don't have a lot of free time to experiment just yet, but we're hopefully, kind of getting ahead, catching up since the expansion and everything, to a point where we can look at maybe trying something different, whether it's, different mash bill or a rye whiskey or barrel finishes. Because I think all of that is interesting. I've had a lot of good barrel finished whiskeys. Something that I'm interested in. I think that there's a lot of innovation going on, and sometimes innovation kind of gets into almost the gimmicky territory, but it's something I understand, because everyone wants to, especially if it's a new brand, do something to differentiate themselves and make a name for themselves. But I think barrel finishes are very interesting, and I wouldn't say that we would never do that. That's something that we might explore in the future.
We got time for one more question. They're fighting. Oh yeah. Go ahead.
Do you like bourbon aged wine? And if so, what's your favorite bottle?
Bourbon aged wine.
Do you enjoy it personally? And do you?
You know, I've had a few that I like, and honestly, I've only had a handful, and it's my brother-in-law. He really likes them, so I've tried several bottles that he's had, and I can't even remember. One might have been 1,000. So I don't know. I can't answer that with any authority at all. But I have enjoyed some of them. I remember I've had one that was, a little bit too much, and that's the whole thing. It's all with the winemaker. And same thing with beer. And I've had a lot more barrel-aged beers than I have wines. And I've had some that are just fantastic, and I've had some that I thought were, kind of like a Boilermaker. It's just, you could taste the beer and you could taste the whiskey. There's really no clean integration. It was just out of balance. But I've had some that have just been fantastic. A good example of that, not to plug our product, but Brooklyn Brewery and Four Roses, we collaborated last year, and we're going to collaborate again this year. They do a release every year. It's Black Ops, where they take a Russian Imperial Stout and age it in whiskey barrels. And they did that last year with our small batch barrels from all 4 recipes. And that was fantastic. And I've had a lot of other really, really good barrel-aged beers.
All right, I'm going to pull an audible and give one more question. Yeah.
More than a question.
Get some crackers. You'll be fine.
With the bourbon barrels, we were lucky last year that to meet Mr. Al Young. He came down to Atlanta. We had an amazing event thanks to Randall and Allison. I think we had around 150 people there. And we were supposed to come up in March and do a barrel pick with him through a store. And Bill, one of our members, had a great present for Mr. Al Young. And we were supposed to deliver that when he was supposed to come up and do the barrel pick. The present is still there. It's still at my place. And we were very sad when that happened. So the barrel was actually picked by Mandy after that, and the profit that we got from that barrel went to the facility that took care of Mr. Al Young. So there's been a great success. People loved it, and we are looking forward to come up and do the next one. And we just bring the present that we made for Mr. Al Young, and we will leave at the distillery if we have a chance to come up next time.
That's very kind of you and very thoughtful. And from the gift all the way to the donation of the barrel proceeds. Yeah, for any of you that didn't meet Al Young, he was with the company for 52 years when he passed away. And he was such a part of Four Roses. He was the distillery manager for many years. He'd been with Seagram's in a lot of different roles. And then I think beginning in 2008, he transitioned to brand ambassador / historian, which was actually the role I think he was born for, because he was doing technical stuff all prior to that, but his background was actually theater. And if you ever got to meet him, he was nothing but personality, the kindest man with a great story. It could keep you riveted with Four Roses stories or bourbon history or stories about anything. Like, he was a storyteller. Just such a loss for the industry and for the people that met him and the people that never got a chance to meet him, and in particular for all of us at Four Roses. So it means a lot to everyone at Four Roses when we realize that people like you guys are doing something special in his memory, or that you're still thinking about Al. So that means a lot. Thank you.
Welcome. Well, guys, I think that's going to conclude this part of the dinner. I'd like to personally thank Brent and Randall and Allison for joining us this evening. So round of applause for our good friends.
Thanks to you all. Enjoy your dinner. Now I really wish I was there.
Yeah, you're definitely now some good food, but next time we will have you down here.
Yeah,
We
I
will,
will be down there, and yeah, I look forward to it. So
and
cheers, everybody. Thank you.
as soon as the world gets its act together, we're coming up to visit you because there's
Please do.
in our future.
Please do.
Cheers, y'all. Thanks for.
Everyone you see here is coming up to say hi to you personally. Us.
You're all
Cheers,
invited.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Guys, enjoy your dinner.
Take care, guys.